Hello and welcome to the second part of our HTML and CSS web development course. In the second part, we are going to look at CSS. So after treating the HTML in our previous part, CSS follows. When we say CSS, what do we mean? CSS is an abbreviation that stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now under CSS, we are going to look at what CSS does, how it works when it is applied to HTML, and the various rules, properties, and values that CSS has. CSS has to do basically with properties and then values that are assigned to certain rules. So a syntax with properties and values. So if you want to be good with CSS, if you want to master CSS, what you should be looking for is selectors and then its properties. Okay, CSS allows you to also specify how the content of an element should appear on a web page. You can specify a specific background for the page. You can also specify specific colors of all your paragraphs. The certain typeface they should have. Typeface is also what we call font, okay, or font face. You can also decide to give certain headings a particular look. That's why we say in our first bullet point that it allows you to create rules that specify how the content of an element should appear. When you are done, you should also understand that in writing CSS rule, what you should be interested in is the different properties that are available for you to use on certain elements. Understanding how CSS works is also to imagine that there is an invisible box around each element. So we told you in the first bullet point that it allows you to specify the content of an element. So you can decide to pick headings. You should assume that there is a box that is surrounding all your headings or all your paragraphs or all your images. That is why the third bullet point says, imagine there is an invisible box, a box around each of the elements, but you cannot see. Okay, so you can decide to give a straight rule for all your paragraphs, straight rule for all your headings, straight rule for all your images, or the entire body of the web page as a whole. So you are going to imagine that there is an invisible box around each of the elements, so that when you are creating rules for them, you create rules for them in block. Now, just like we do in HTML, in CSS too, we have block and inline elements. That's why we are trying to connect the HTML to our CSS. We explained in HTML that block elements start on a new line. So examples include our divs, our headings, our paragraphs, our list. These are called block level elements because when you apply them in your code, it starts on a new line. The content between them starts on a new line. Whilst inline elements flow within the text and do not start on a new line. Examples of inline elements include the bold, the italic, the image, the emphasis, and then the span. CSS also allows you to create rules that control the way each individual invisible box is presented. Okay, it allows you to create rules that control how individual box must be presented. I spoke about selectors and I also spoke about declaration, which is the property. CSS also associates some rules with HTML elements, and these rules show the content of specified elements and how they must be displayed. Every CSS rule has two main parts, which is a selector and a declaration. The selector is most likely to be the HTML element, while the declaration has to do with the property you want to associate with that particular selector. So in this example, as you see it here, the P is our selector, whilst the one in the curly bracket, font family Arial, is the declaration. Okay, now the explanation of this particular CSS rule, you see, as you see it here, means it is indicating that all the paragraph elements should be shown in Arial typeface. So we are giving all our paragraphs a particular typeface or a particular font face, which is what? Arial. We are saying this Arial should apply to all our paragraphs within the page. That's exactly what this rule means. Now, what are selectors and declarations? Selectors indicate which elements the rule applies to. The same rule can apply to more than one element. We will go into that and explain how to choose specific selectors and then apply specific declarations to them. And when we say declaration, declarations also indicate how the element referred to in the selector should be styled. So if you look at our previous examples, the selector is the P, okay, this paragraph here, whilst our declaration is the one in the curly bracket. CSS declarations sit inside curly bracket, and each is made up of two parts, a property and a value. Let me go back to explain using this code. Now the property is font family, okay, and there's a column just at the end. This is what? The property, and this is the value of the property, okay, the value that is being given to this property, and it should sit in a curly bracket. So CSS declaration or properties and values, if you check this particular one, I'm sure by now you are able to interpret it. The interpretations are the ones in yellow. So H1, H2 and H3, which means heading 1, heading 2, and then the third level heading should be what? Should have a property of what? Font family and a value of Arial, whilst another what? Property is color. It should be in red. This rule indicates that all H1 to H3 elements should be shown in Arial and in red color. I'll give an example where I have used this particular rule. Now, what properties are? They are the aspects of the elements you want to change. For example, color, font, font family, width, height, border. Those are the particular things we are interested in changing or in giving rules to. Once the value specify the settings you want to use for the chosen properties. So for example, you want the color of your headings to be red. You want the color with the entire body should be cream. You want all your paragraphs should be in a particular typeface. Okay, so you apply a particular value to those particular properties you want to make changes to. Okay, I have H1 here, H2 and H3. So let me just go to my CSS file. So as you see this particular CSS file, what I want to do is apply to the entire body a font family of Arial. If Arial is not found, you should go to Vedana. If Vedana is not found, you should go to what? Sans serif. And my headings H1, H2 and H3 should have a color of red, and then the paragraph should have ash. So I can then decide to change the color for my headings, okay, and then the color of the paragraph should remain ash. Let me just save this file. Let me just view it in the browser. Now this is what is happening. Just like we explained, that what we actually want to change is what we call the property, and then the value we give to that property determines the settings we want for a particular property we have what chosen to change or to edit. So I can just come back to my and then just play around it. I can give this, let me give it back the red. come to my case here. So when I save this file now, Ctrl S, and I go back to view, I should see the changes that what I've applied to it. Now let's talk about external CSS and internal. First of all, we talk about external. In this example, you see this is an external CSS. This is my main HTML document, and I've what given a link to my CSS file, which is here. Okay, I've linked this particular file externally. It is not on the same page with the HTML. It is somewhere else, and then I've linked it on the HTML. So you can see the link, the hypertext reference, which is the file I'm referencing. You can see the name of the file here, and it has a type. The type is what? Test/CSS, and a relationship of what? Style sheet. This particular syntax should be in this way so that you can link external files. I'll also explain how to use internal CSS. When, let's say, you are creating a one-page website, you don't need a lot of styles. You can just decide to what? Put your CSS codes on the same HTML page, and I'll show you how that one also works. Now, using external CSS, you need link. So the link element can be used in an HTML document to tell the browser where to find it. We use a lot of links in our HTML, so we should understand links by now. Every link should contain 3 attributes: an href, which is hypertext reference, which specifies the folder or the place to find the particular CSS file. It's also what contain another attribute called type. The type also specifies the type of documents linked to. So in this case, we said our type value should be what? Test/CSS. And the relationship. The rel also specifies the relationship between the HTML page and the file it is linked to. And in this case, we said since we are linking it to a CSS file, the value of the rel should be what? Star sheet. It should be what? Star sheet. This is using internal CSS. When you are using internal CSS, instead of bringing a link that has 3 values, let's say the value of type, the value of relationship, and the value of href, when you're using internal CSS, you don't have to link it to any external document. So you don't need an href, you don't need a link. What you need is a star. You can also use the star and then place all your CSS code between the star. So you open a star and then you close a star. In between those stars, you enter your CSS code. But this should be stated in the what? In the head element of the page. Okay, it should sit in the head element of the page. It shouldn't be at the bottom under the body. It should be in the head. The star element should also use a type of test/CSS. Okay, and then when building a site which has more than one page, the best form of what? Styling should be what? External and not internal. Okay, so when you have multiple pages, use what? External. But if you are using, let's say, a one page which you don't have to do a lot of styling, you can use internal CSS. Now, what are selectors? I explained selectors earlier to mean the target rules. Okay, many types of CSS selectors that allow you to target rules to specific elements in an HTML document. CSS selectors are also case sensitive. Remember when we're doing HTML, we told you HTML is case insensitive, but CSS selectors are case sensitive. So you make sure that whichever selector you are picking and applying values to it or properties to it must be exactly the way it is in the HTML. Okay, so if it is a small p, it should be a small p. okay, so that it will match the element names. Other than that, you'll be styling different elements that we are not ready to change its value. And there are some advanced selectors which allow you to select elements based on attributes and their values. We explain all those ones very soon. Now look at this 3-column table. This 3-column table has selectors in the first column, the meaning or what those selectors mean, and an example is given. Okay, if you want to apply those particular rules. The first one is universal selector. A universal selector is what? An asterisk here. Okay, an asterisk and the curly bracket, so that every property and value should be within the curly bracket. What this one does is that, as the name suggests, universal, it applies to all elements in the document. So if you want to apply a particular style to almost everything in the document, in your styling, you use don't use body, don't use P to represent paragraph, don't use H1, H2, H3. What you have to do is use asterisk. The asterisk simply means it will apply to almost every element. Another type of selector is what you call the type selector. In this case, you are being specific to a particular element. So if you check here, H1, H2, H3, this is just like the example we explained earlier. This target only the specific type that have been stated. So if it's a P, you indicate a P. H1, H2, H3, P. You apply the same rules to them, and the property and the value will be within the curly bracket. Class selectors. In class selectors, we are trying to narrow down what we want to do. Okay, in class selectors, we precede the name of the class with what? Dot, to indicate that it is what? It is a class. So let's say if an element contains a class of what? Note, it is going to target the class attribute that has the value of note. It wouldn't apply to any other thing else. An ID is different from a class selector. An ID selector also, okay, precedes with what? With a hash. It doesn't proceed with a dot. A dot or a full stop or a period is always related to classes, class selectors. And ID selectors are also preceded by what? Hash, or others call it pound. And all our properties and values are contained within the curly bracket. There's a child selector. Let's say you have a parent element. Within the parent element, there is a child element in there. You can decide to target only the child, so that it doesn't apply to the entire element. Let's say the heading. Let's say the heading or an order list contain a list of items. You can decide to take the particular list item, let's say the third one, and then we will style it by giving it a particular class or a particular ID, so we can easily target it. But in this child selector, it matches an element that is direct child of another. For instance, in this case, there is a list, and inside the list there is an anchor, that is a link. Okay, this targets any element that are children of an element, but not other elements in the page. So in this case, the anchor is specific to a list item. So this is how you present it. Li, they do the right angle bracket, and then you indicate the name of the child. All your settings and all your properties should be within the curly brackets. Apart from child selector, we also have descendant selector. This matches an element that is a descendant of another specified element, not just a direct child of that element. For example, inside the paragraph, there's a descendant, which is what? An anchor. For the rule of the child, it is direct child of the selector, but in descendant it is not direct, okay, but it can also be a direct child of a different element that has been specified. So in this case, this PA targets any anchor element that sit in a paragraph element, even if there are other elements nested between them. Okay, and we have adjacent sibling selector. Adjacent sibling selector. This matches an element that is next sibling to another. And how you represent it, let's say H1 and there's a plus and there's a P, and all your properties and values will come between the curly brackets. What this rule means is that it should target the first paragraph, okay, after any level 1 heading element, but not other paragraphs. It should be the first paragraphs of every H1 element. And we also have a general sibling. In this case, not an adjacent sibling, but a general sibling. So for instance, you have two elements that are siblings of an element. This rule will apply to both of them. It's a general sibling. This one is adjacent sibling. So this one is kind of specific to the paragraph that comes directly after a heading, level 1 heading. So if I want first paragraph between after a level 2 heading, I'll do H2 plus P. Okay, so that's how this adjacent sibling works, and the general sibling apply to what? Let's say all the siblings within a particular element. How CSS rules cascade. Remember, I told you CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. Now, if there are two or more rules that apply to the same element, it is important to understand which one will take precedence over the other. Definitely, you cannot be working with two commands for the same element at the same time. So in this case, the last rule will take precedence over the previous rule. If two selectors are identical, the latter of the two will take precedence. Here you can see a second. I will explain those all the rules and how it works, how it applies. Okay. Another thing you must also know under CSS is to what? To be specific. Okay, to be specific. If one selector is more specific than the other, it is going to work on the more specific one. That one will take precedence over the general ones. Now look at the examples stated here. H1 as you see it here is more specific than the asterisk. I told you the asterisk is what? It's a universal selector. This applies to almost every element, but this is more specific. So if the rule applies the same to both of them, it will take what? This will take precedence over that. Now a PB is more specific than a P. P just talks about almost every paragraph, but this is talking about a B that is found in a particular P. So this PB is more specific than a general P. Now this is also what? An ID. Okay, an ID. So PH intro is more specific than a P, just like in the case here. This is more specific than this, but this one is going directly to a particular paragraph and select a particular ID element and apply to it. Now importance also, you can decide to give some of your properties importance over the other. Okay, in this case, those ones that you have indicated as important are going to take precedence over those that are what? Less important. Now inheritance, you remember we were doing child, sibling, adjacent sibling, universal sibling, and what have you. in CSS there are relationships. Okay, if you specify the font family or color properties of the body, the entire body element, they will apply to most child elements because the entire body contains all the visual area of the page. This includes the element and each child element. It saves you from having to apply these properties to as many elements as possible. So we always encourage people to write less CSS codes or CSS rules. Write rules that apply to most, okay, to most of the elements you have, so as to reduce the number of CSS rules you will have to write for a particular website. Okay, if you want to write every rule for each of the elements, it is going to be a lot of work. So you can compare this with the background color or border properties. They are not inherited. Okay, because background color or background properties are specific to specific elements. You cannot generalize it. If this were inherited by all child elements, then the page could look messy. You can apply the same rule to the entire body and apply the background color also. That is going to apply to almost every child element. It's not going to look nice at all. Okay, but in some instances you are also forced to allow a lot of your properties to inherit values from their parent, just like I explained, by using the values. Okay, I'm going to show you some example that applies to most of them, and then we are going to try to make some sense out of that. Now div, we all did div when we're treating HTML. Div element with a class called page inherits the padding size from a CSS rule that applies to the body. We are still talking about the inheritance. When we use a div element and give it a class, okay, let's say we name the name of the class is page. It can be any name. This is going to inherit the padding. That means the space between the borders. Okay, that applies to the entire body. Now, why do you think we should use external style sheets? I explained earlier, okay, that when building a website that has a lot of pages, it is advisable to use external CSS. Now, why is it important to use external CSS? We use external CSS because, one, all of your web pages can share the same style sheet. This is achieved by using the link, just like we did in our first example, and then link or write the code, the CSS rules for all your elements within a page, and then link it together. Once the user has downloaded the CSS style sheet, the rest of the site will load faster. If you want to make a change on how your site appears, you only have to edit the CSS file and not go on your HTML. For example, you can change the style of your H1 element by just altering one CSS style sheet rather than changing the entire CSS rules on every page. That is if you are creating multiple pages and you are doing internal CSS. That means on each of the page you will have to specify which particular CSS rule to use. But when you are using one style sheet and linking it together on your home page, what it does is it applies to almost every page of your website. Okay, it's considered as a good practice, okay, to have the content of your website separated from the rules, okay, so that you can easily make your changes. Now let's practicalize the internal and external CSS. So this external CSS, I'm trying to name this file styles.css. Let me just save this. This will be the HTML that has this link. So let me just load in my CSS codes. This is my CSS. Let me just edit this code now and save it. Let me try a link. It's css.css. Let me save this file as well. Let me head straight to my browser and see if it works. Now it works. What we did was that we applied this rule. What are the rules? These are the rules, which says the entire body. Okay, that means the entire visual area of the web page, which is the entire this part, the visual area of the web page should have Arial, and the background color should be this. So let's say gray or ash. Okay, that should be the what I use the RGB, the red, green and blue. I will explain that one later in our lessons. And our H1 should be white. Our H1, which is this, should be white, and you can see it is white in color. So this is what external CSS, by bringing a link, okay, bringing a link indicating the href, indicating the file we are linking it to, indicate the type, and then the relationship between the HTML and the CSS. And we will create a different CSS sheet, and this is the sheet we are going to link to this HTML. Let me also practicalize internal CSS. So I'm going to take out this link and relationship. We don't need it. So let me load the codes for internal CSS. Let me just change this to internal CSS. So you can imagine changing the color. So first of all, we put in the star, we close the star, and we give it a property of type, and then we give it a value of test/css, okay, and then the body. So this is just what we apply to the external CSS. These are the same codes I've just copied and I've pasted it in the style. So the same code to come here, but just that I changed the color, so we actually see that things are working. I made the background a bit brighter, and I made the H1 color red, so that we can easily identify the difference and how it works. So let me just save this, come to my browser and refresh. So you can see that now our H1 is now red, just like we indicated in the internal CSS style, and our entire body is a bit brighter as compared to the initial gray, while this one was white. Okay, so whether you use internal CSS or external CSS, it is up to you. But then best practice is to use external CSS if you are working on multiple web pages. Okay, you have a very large website you are creating, you'll have to use external CSS to save yourself. So what you have to do is just to bring the link and then link the CSS to the HTML. Now that we have a brief explanation of what CSS is, we are going to do more and more practical in this particular, or in the subsequent chapters we are going to treat. The next chapter, which is our chapter 11, is going to talk about color. Okay, we want to explain what colors are in CSS and how to apply them in our website. Thank you.